Hi, everyone. Sorry I'm late. It's Quentin here. Irfan's joining us in a minute.
Hello, guys. If everybody is around, we can start also. I see Ivan, I see Maru. Is Paul going to join? Ivan, Maru, either of you can update.
Unclear.
Okay. Okay.
I don't think he's going to join.
Oh. Okay.
Because he's on vacation.
Yeah, I remember. Last meeting also he was on vacation, but he did join. So that's what I was curious. So I did update a couple of items for today's discussion. Maru, in your absence, we had some chat about possibility of releasing an alpha by the end of June. So last meeting also this item was there in the agenda, but we did not really talk or discuss about it. What did we decide is that we'll update whatever items we think ideally should be part of this alpha release as issues, and then we can reconcile in this today's sync. So I did update a set of issues. All of them might need, not necessarily be considered for alpha, but that's what we are intending. I mean, that's what our initial planning or intention was that we would. So we can talk about them. We can talk about them in a bit. Before that, there were a couple of other pointers, like last week or in a week prior to that also, I did mention about the review and merge timelines. So earlier we did actually segregate this work ownership, as Red Hat would focus on the low-level implementation and the 3 basic types, and the a push reconciler associated with that. And we, as in Huawei, would put their efforts in the higher level implementations. So honestly speaking, I found myself a little constrained given there is no ownership or we have in the repo. So I would want a little chat on that, maybe, whatever is appropriate.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I think sort of one of my deliverables for alpha is to kind of make sure things are separated. So I'd like to see separate binaries for the push reconciler, for DNS controller, for scheduling. And the idea would be is if we had sort of separate binaries, if we had sort of operationally distinct entities, then I would be far more comfortable not providing oversight. Like if you need oversight, great, but if you just want to work on something and merge it, I think that's fine, so long as there's a clear line of responsibility. I mean, we're currently maintaining, like, as you said, the push reconciliation mechanism. And so the goal would be, in the near term at least, while we're working on things that we have sort of a business interest in, we're responsible for maintaining that. It's not that we don't coordinate and make sure that we have a cohesive release, because we're going to be sharing API at the very least. But at least then the controller stuff, like, I don't really have the time or energy to do exhaustive review of some of the work you're doing, and I don't really want to block you. And we're kind of, if what I'm hearing is correct, you're kind of noticing that too, that you're kind of feeling constrained by a lack of oversight. And the question is, like, is it even necessary? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that we might not have very stringent coding or review guidelines for alpha release at least. And I or Shashi also did not actually look into many of the PRs that you guys earlier worked on. So that's like because we were trying to focus on what we were doing. So once we have something workable in place in alpha, after that we can probably define a proper guideline for cross reviews and merging of PRs. But until then, I guess it should ideally be okay that we have a functional code and we are able to have something working out there, maybe in pieces, not necessarily as one individual monolithic stuff, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, if things are broken apart, I think it sort of, for some reason, I hadn't really realized, but I mean, I think one of the barriers to experimentation is if everything has to be distributed, via one monolithic, binary or one image. But if we just consider like, okay, we're going to have some common API constructs, and then we'll have, controllers. The controllers, ultimately, maybe the controllers can even live in separate repos. Like, to me, it's not that we don't want to have a cohesive way of bringing things together and saying, this is federation. But in terms of like the development strategy, I think, having interested parties being able to work independently, I think that's a win. It's not that we won't have things that we want to share responsibility for, but I don't know that it's everything. And to me, that kind of, I think that reflects the spirit of sort of Kubernetes development model, how it's evolving anyway. So,
what would be your, yep, go ahead. No, go ahead. I was just asking what would be your suggestion of making progress right now?
I think right now, the next, I think breaking into separate binaries and separate images would be sort of the first step. And as long as we're sort of moving towards that for alpha, like I can provide, cursory oversight, and I'm sure other members of the Red Hat team, I think we're more interested in the DNS thing, but the scheduling, I don't think we're really at a point where we know we have good use cases to be able to support like providing oversight. And so in that case, so long as it's something separate and optional, like you can run it or you don't have to run it, I'd be happy to see you merging stuff when you think it's ready, when it meets your needs.
Okay. Would you have any suggestion on the ownership of the repo at this point of time? Ownership, reviewership, or whatever way you call it.
I mean, I think in the near term, it's just a matter of ownership of whatever component. So, I mean, Red Hat, we kind of own the push reconciler part. We probably, we'd have shared responsibility for the API, since that's kind of a common point of interaction. I would expect that Huawei would have ownership of the scheduling component, and we probably share responsibility for the DNS component. I mean, you're doing a lot of the work, but we're definitely, that is a deliverable for us. So I think there'll be more engagement there.
Just a suggestion. I mean, ultimately, we need owners for the repo. Like in the root of the repo, we need to have some owners. And I would suggest the key
on that question.
The key people from Red Hat and Huawei and whoever else is actively working on this stuff. We need, a few of those people. And so if we can just add Shashi and Irfan there, I mean, clearly they're not going to go and merge rubbish, and they're not going to, block work that you guys are doing. But just from a mechanical point of view, we need to do that. And then I think later we can decide if we want to have a repo just with, the API in it, or portions of the API, and then separate repos for each controller. I would personally prefer us not to take on that burden right now. It's just busy work, and there's quite a lot of work around getting all of those repos, with CI testing, and makes deployment slightly more difficult. But we can certainly do that down the road. I don't think it adds a huge amount of value right now.
I agree. I apologize. The question of ownership, I didn't realize that you were specifically talking about adding to the owners file. Feel free to raise a PR, and any one of us would be happy to merge it for you. And I agree about, I'm not suggesting that we break into separate repos now, just that to me, breaking apart responsibility for the controllers sort of within the repo now by having separate binaries or images is a start. And that paves the way in the future, if we feel we want to actually doing work in different repos.
Makes sense. Cool. I had a quick question about the push reconciler if we finish with the previous topic. So I've had some external companies coming to me, Upbound in particular, who are interested in a sort of a very basic reusable push reconciler, which doesn't do template substitution or anything like that. I understand that right now the template substitution and the propagation are kind of the same piece of code and the same binary. Is there any plan to separate those two? Or do you have a proposal as to how someone could take a simple thing that can just propagate well-defined resources to clusters with reconciliation?
I think that there's certainly room for breaking it apart. I don't really see it as a near-term priority because.
Okay, but if they wanted to do that, we would support them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my question is, why do they think they need substitution? Like today, if you were to create resources without overrides, they would just propagate without overrides. Do they need some different behavior than that?
So I think their requirement is that they have a controller which puts all sorts of logic in place and just wants to spit out fundamental Kubernetes resources to be propagated to the underlying clusters reliably. And I don't think they can do that today without generating templates and getting the existing substitution logic, which may or may not be adequate for them to do the substitution and propagation together. So that's how I understand the requirement. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's not a big deal. I was just wondering where we stood on that. The design says that the actual template substitution controller generates Kubernetes resources, and then the propagator propagates those to clusters, which makes sense in my mind, and that's what these guys have requested. But I don't think we have that right now. So
it's correct, but I'm curious whether the assumption is that those Kubernetes resources are being serialized to the API, because they're not at present. So,
yes, and so I think that's what they want. And I think they want that because they don't want to rely on whatever template substitution we do for some reason, and I don't fully understand that. If it's the case that they can actually use the existing substitution, then there doesn't seem to be an urgent need for separating it out. If for some reason they want to generate their own things, then we would need to separate that. Okay.
I mean, I think that hopefully, I guess for me, what you're talking about raises more questions than answers for me, and I guess I would hope that there would be more detail. I'm certainly amenable to breaking things apart so that reuse is possible. But it's not clear to me that their use case is really in line with what the push reconciler is intended to do. Not just the substitution, but just the way that it functions is very specific, maybe too specific. But I need to know more about their use case, I guess.
I think that's actually their main observation, is they're very fond of this idea of simple reusable components that can be pieced together, and the cluster registry is one such thing, which, they've also have the idea of a component that will actually build clusters. So when you register a cluster, maybe, and this sounds more like cluster API, and I'm not going to comment on whether it's a good idea, but you can imagine a situation where you have a high-level object, like a replica set or something, which needs replicas on each continent, let's say, and there are no clusters on a given continent, and it could build a cluster in order to deploy the replica set there. It doesn't sound like a completely crazy idea. Exactly how they would do that is another question. But these small building blocks that can be pieced together for things like that would be useful. And one such building block is just something that knows how to propagate to clusters.
I mean, the idea that there's something as simple as I just want to propagate to clusters, like, I guess the thinking that we've done around like these primitives is that like you kind of want you can call it we call it a template here. I mean, previously in Federation V1, it was just a standard Kubernetes resource. But I mean, unless they're wanting to go back to that model, like you kind of need some sort of resource that identifies, the form that is to appear in the clusters, and then placement, which is indicating which clusters it should appear in. Are they talking about doing something like with those kind of primitives, or are they talking about going back to just simple Kubernetes resources and annotations or something like that?
No, not annotations, not simple Kubernetes resources, but things like distributed databases. So they would want a higher level CRD, which was, for example, a distributed Cockroach DB database, and then they would want to decide where to put it based on a whole bunch of Cockroach DB specific logic, and where to put all the data in the shards and whatever else, and then generate, underlying Kubernetes objects in all the right clusters. But they don't want to have to do all the propagation themselves and reconciliation.
I guess my hope would be is that they'd be able to generate template and placement for the creation of the resources. It's not clear that that really fills their entire use case, but in terms of distributing configuration to multiple clusters, that's kind of what the push reconciler or a theoretical pull reconciler.
I understand. I guess I don't really understand what your objection is to splitting the template substitution out from the propagation to the clusters.
Oh, so I guess I'm not really understanding your question. Is the idea that they need like a different template substitution mechanism? Potentially. Or they just don't want it at all?
But beyond that...
Quentin, I can chime in. This is Ilya from Abound. Hi. So what we're looking for in kind of high level is that ability to deploy custom resource definition and federated plane, which will hold and get responsibility of propagating things without necessarily using templatized version of current Federation V2. And as Quentin also mentioned earlier about separating cluster registers potentially, we would like to have functionality not necessarily templatized in which cluster it should go into, but rather than have failure domains for clusters where we can identify clusters by provider and region, let's say, and just define kind of affinity or failure domains for those. So what we look at is possibility to need propagate resources to target clusters, whether it's custom resource definitions or otherwise, but not necessarily leveraging current template approach. In other words, multi-cluster controller, for example, could take responsibility of creating or generating those target definition resources without necessarily using templates.
I guess I'm not clear on, the push reconciler is templating, but I guess the thing you're looking for is just something to copy configuration around. I'm not sure you need the push reconciler to do that, because it's not really that hard a problem. The problem with the push reconciler is more about being able to take a template and placement and make sure that the configuration that represents is, pushed to the underlying clusters. But if you're just talking about pushing configuration, like there's lots of tooling outside of Federation that could do that.
Yeah, I think we will look at something under umbrella Federation, because we're definitely going to be leveraging some of the Federation components, like let's say federated deployments and secrets, but other one goes in realm of CRDs, then we're probably going to get more involved hands-on propagation, maybe not necessarily leveraging templates.
Yeah, Maru, how do you, just out of interest, how do you propose or foresee the pull propagator working? My understanding would be that the pull propagator would be able to say, what should I have in my cluster, and pull it into the cluster, and not be responsible for doing any of the template substitution, for example. And it shouldn't need to know. So that would seem to imply that something needs to generate specific templates, or not templates, specific Kubernetes resources that could be pulled into those clusters.
Correct. And the model that I've been envisioning is basically a YAML generator. So it's using the same primitives that the push reconciler would use, but it would generate YAML into Git repos, and those Git repos would be monitored by something like kubeapplier. So I mean, this is only one model, but I think the advantage of this model is that you no longer have a central point of failure in the Federation API. Once you have configuration pushed to a Git repo or whatever other store, and the resources that would be pushed there, as you say, would be like Kubernetes resources, not like they'd be templatized or whatever. And then whatever controller existed in the clusters would be responsible for reconciling that source of truth for the individual cluster with its state, its cluster state. Does that make sense?
It does. I guess I'm trying to. So would it be a completely separate binary from the push reconciler, which is actually a template substitution reconciler also? And
it might reuse some code, but essentially it would just be taking the current state and generating changes into a source of truth. The Git repo is one implementation of that.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
So I mean, the goal was making sure we had primitives that would support both. We haven't really had the resources or inclination to implement a pull reconciliation mechanism yet, or a YAML generator or whatever. But that's entirely, that's work that I'm assuming will need to be done at some point for any users for whom a single point of failure is unacceptable. I don't know that there's a better solution than pushing configuration to storage medium that can be replicated trivially. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's a fundamental difference between a Git repo and a HA API server. I mean, they're both.
Well, the problem with an HA API server is it's not really geographically distributed. Like if you have a region go down, HA doesn't really save you.
Yeah, I don't think GitHub does that either.
But the point is that once you have serialized it to, GitHub is one example, but it could be S3, it's just data without an API necessarily, and replicated storage is kind of a solved problem in the cloud.
Yeah, S3 is also only in a region.
Right, but I guess my suggestion is it's much easier to synchronize data at that level versus coordinating APIs being up. Like Kubernetes, at least maybe I'm just misunderstanding, but I haven't seen a good way of ensuring uptime of a single Kubernetes cluster across regions, whereas distributing data seems an easier problem. But anyway, I guess we're probably rat-holing now. Theoretically, we can do a pull reconciler and have certain qualities that some users may desire. So in terms of getting to alpha, before I left on PTO, I created a few issues or a couple issues, added a milestone. I targeted June 15th, which is maybe optimistic. I wasn't really sure what the deliverables were going to be, but I guess we can maybe hash that out. For me, I would like to see separate binaries and images for the 3 controllers, I guess, that we would tentatively ship.
Are those all currently compiled into a single binary?
I believe they are. I mean, we have yet to merge the PRs for the DNS and the scheduling controllers.
I was referring to the other stuff, to the other controllers, or is there only one of them?
There's really only one after the refactor to support CRDs. There's basically a sync controller manager that will launch sync controllers based on configuration in the API. So it's entirely driven by API data. There's no flags or requirement to implement adapters in code. Supporting a CRD is a matter of creating the correct configuration in the API.
So, Maru, can't we use that same federated type config to use some fields in federated type config to define enabling, disabling other controllers also?
It's not really a generic controller configuration mechanism. It's very specifically like tied to push reconciliation. So if you look at the API type definition, it's what's my template, what's my replacement, what's my override if I have override, what's the target type. I'm not saying that you couldn't create something generic, but I'm not sure of the value.
Yeah, I have seen the config. So we are anyways naming specific fields. We can have an additional field. For example, we have placement override and template. We can have a higher level config, something like that. A field name, I'm just suggesting it could be a different field name also.
I guess my question would be, why wouldn't that just be a different API type? This is specifically designed to configure push reconciliation, not to start generic controllers.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Also to my mind, like having separate controllers that do different things, I think that's operationally a lot simpler. Like if I think about Federation V1 and how I would determine if a given controller was running, I would go in and I would examine the configuration of the deployments, or I would look at the logs and see messages for controllers starting up. And I think it would be much simpler if there was, different controllers ran as different deployments, and you could scale them independently, and you could manage the resource usage independently.
Yeah, I understand. I understand all these points. So what you are saying actually makes more sense. This particular scenario that you mentioned makes more sense for a developer. What I was considering it as a user's perspective, like how a user would want. So I actually created one issue also. So my intention of creating that issue was that a user who deploys a control plane might want a set of binaries only to be enabled. Set of APIs only to be enabled, or a set of related controllers to those APIs to be enabled or disabled. Some mechanism of doing that. That's what was in my mind.
Right. I guess I'm saying, sorry, keep going.
Yeah, if you think it is more also important to keep the developers' point of view, like segregating the development effort and debugging and that kind of stuff, then it does make sense to separate builds out.
Part of this is if we have separate images for different controllers, then users can deploy them however they want.
But it's more difficult for them. According
not
to
necessarily.
Me,
I'm not suggesting that we don't give them help. I think this is where the sort of coordination, like Federation V2 is a coordination between all these different components. We'll package things, we'll provide user guides and installation help and that sort of thing. I would expect that it would, we would make it easy to deploy these things in a standard way, but then we wouldn't preclude doing arbitrary things that Kubernetes allows. And rather than having to, define a configuration mechanism that says, oh, I want to run this controller, I want to run that controller, I want to run it with these configurations, and have that all in one big binary, every single controller can define how it exposes configuration independently. And it doesn't have to be considered in the context of the whole thing. I just think about like Kubernetes controller manager is huge and monolithic and really complicated. I don't really think that's a good model to follow. There's a reason for efficiency that they'll be all in the same place because you can have shared informers and stuff. But sorry, keep going.
Yeah, I think that both these API server builder and kube builder, both these provide exactly this mechanism to separate out your own implementation of your own API type and the controller for it. But if we are using the same call it scaffolding or the infrastructure, for example, if we put all our controllers and APIs in one repo or one domain, which is generated by either API server builder or the cube builder, then it's slightly difficult to generate different bins and then run them separately. Rather than, I mean, it'll be super easy if we just have different repos where these tools like the API server boot or the cube builder provide all this mechanism. They auto generate YAMLs for you. They create the container for you. That kind of stuff. If we are managing everything in a single repo, it might be slightly difficult. That's what I meant.
I think that API Server Builder kind of makes, I think it confuses this issue. Because with API Server Builder, we have to deploy an API server. And that means there's certain constraints on how we define the API. Just like it's streamlined it. As you noticed, you can only define like a single API, what is it, group. You can only define a single API.
Particular group.
Yeah, and you can't get around that. And I think part of the reason for that is because it's running an API server and it needs to register it with, what is it? You have
the
to
aggregator.
API service. Yeah, the aggregator. And the way the aggregator works is, you register a service with a given group and it knows to forward requests for that group to your server. Now, as soon as we go to CRD, I believe that restriction goes away. Because essentially, like a CRD, you can create it with any group version you want, and so
I also believe so. Yes.
Yeah. So to me, I'm kind of looking forward to that, and assuming that's going to ultimately be what we're delivering to users. There's still kind of, I guess, it's not clear or decided that we're going to move to that for alpha, but if we look forward to a world where we're not tied to a single group and any arbitrary controller in any given repo could integrate with Federation merely by registering CRDs and vendoring the API, to me that's a world that is a lot simpler for a developer, but it also simplifies things for the user, because then they don't have to worry about having even one aggregated API and worrying about operating it and how it integrates with things.
Yeah, I don't deny that it's actually quite useful, and maybe that's the path we ideally should take in future. What I was moving at is there would be some effort which will be required currently if we use either of these. Even if we use API Server Builder for generating code and generating the scaffolding and whatever way we are deploying, we were relying on that until now, right? And even if we move to Cube Builder, in that case also there is some automated stuff. There are say some 3 or 4 automated steps. It will just give you the API structure and a YAML and probably a container for your controller. I don't know, maybe I have missed something. I don't know if you have to generate, say, 3 containers for 3 different controllers in the same repo where you have initiated your domain, if it is super easy or it is easy at all, or we will have to override a lot of stuff. And that's what I was intending at. Right. I don't deny that we should move there, but what I'm saying is using these particular tools, it might be a slightly more effort for us.
Yeah,
which I don't know how much.
Yeah, no, I think your concern is well-founded. I think there's a certain amount of risk because I don't think any of us are terribly familiar with Cube Builder. And so creating multiple binaries, to me, that would be something to investigate and see if it's a reasonable thing to do or if it's going to be too time consuming. I mean, we're using API Server Builder, I think it's been useful. It's got us bootstrapped and working without having to worry about all of the infrastructure that like Kubernetes requires, for example. As soon as we move away from aggregation, its value becomes a little bit less clear to me, because we're not developing simple controllers. We can't just use the generated stubs they give us in most cases. I think the main utility once we would move to CRDs would be client generation. I'm not sure we have to tie ourselves to a framework to do that. We might be able to crib pieces of it and reuse the build infrastructure without having to tie ourselves to put ourselves within the box that it puts us in currently. But anyway, sorry, to your point though, that's something we need to de-risk, is see if it's possible to, what it would take to generate multiple binaries. And were there other concerns you have? Because to me, it's like, let's list these out, let's, make them issues and make sure that we cover them.
Yeah, so this certainly is something worth investigating. What would it take to generate separate binaries? And for that, I did miss listing this, like migration to CRDs. As of now, should we ideally target it for this alpha or not? That is also, that is also one open question. We probably need to talk about that also.
Right. I guess I missed the discussion last week. I guess there was a topic of conversation, as I understand. Would you care to summarize the result of that discussion?
So last time I did raise the concern, but it was like everybody sort of agreed to it, except Dario raised some concerns, and I'm not sure what's his exact use case, which might need necessarily CRD-based infrastructure. To me, actually, both of these are sort of differences in infrastructure. I spent some time generating the similar API type or kind or whatever using both Kube Builder earlier and API Server Builder. We already know that. The generation and the steps to use and that stuff is not greatly different. And in fact, the APIs that would be exposed after that, that will also remain same. The controller logic also grossly remains same. The difference is only how the APIs are registered with the API server. So in our case, the API server builder's case, a separate API server is run and it is registered by that aggregator. In the case of CRDs, it's directly registered with the API server using the CRD extension.
Yeah, my point is that in using CRD, you'll be able to use a normal Kubernetes cluster and just promote it to a federated control plane. It's going to be pretty straightforward. And probably the other difference is the definition of alpha. I would say I have a time to see an alpha as soon we call it this alpha, then we would expect a beta. And in my mind, since the technology is pretty different, I have a time to call it alpha if the technology at the base is going to change. But I'm okay to accept the fact that day one we are going to deliver it as an API server, an external API server, and after that we're going to move to a CRD eventually.
Actually, in both cases, the user experience probably wouldn't change much. So
I agree. I agree.
Well, define a user though, because operationally having to have an STD cluster that's reliable enough to back an API server, to me that's always been kind of a bit of a stumbling block for me. It's hard enough to do that for Kubernetes, let alone something that's running on Kubernetes.
No, what I mean to say is that the consumer of the API, the user as a consumer of the API, the federated API, for them it doesn't really make a great difference if it's running aggregated or it's running as a installed API.
I agree, but in terms of operation, I think that using a CRD is going to be easier.
That's correct. That's accepted. But I think we had this conversation a couple of months, I guess, ago.
Okay.
So there is a clear guideline. There is in docs, in Kubernetes docs also, there is a clear guideline about when you might want to use CRDs or when you might want to use the aggregation. And one of the pressing reasons of starting with aggregation was CRDs at that point of time were not that mature. And I think one of the limitations was how the versioning of APIs is used in CRDs. So there is no mechanism of versioning APIs if you're using CRDs, which is possible in terms of aggregation. So
yes,
I still...
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So I still think that aggregation sort of suits more of our use case, because we basically need to have a clear path of evolution of APIs from say alpha to beta or whatever. I don't know really how exactly that's handled in CRDs, but if that's more useful or there are some other reasons of using that, I would certainly be open to that.
So if, and I'm not sure that I can see the point that we need versioning, but if we needed versioning, then you're correct that aggregation would be, I think, the only option. However, I'm not actually sure we need versioning. I'm not sure to what extent versioning is really useful outside of something huge like Kubernetes. Like my expectation would be is we're going to have relatively simple things that we're going to evolve over the course of, you know, alpha and beta. Nobody in their right mind is going to be using this in production at an alpha level and need to migrate to beta. And it's questionable in my mind that we're going to have any backwards incompatible changes between beta and V1. And so to me, it's like I would expect that we are going to get versioning in CRDs eventually, because like user extensions, I think it's required, but I think for our use cases, I don't think it's necessary. And so putting it as a blocker, like, oh, we can't use CRDs because we need this feature, I would put it in your mind that maybe we need to question whether we actually need this feature. And if we don't, we make our lives a lot easier. And it doesn't preclude getting versioning. I'm not trying to say, oh, we'll never need versioning. But to my mind, like up to V1, it's questionable to me whether we're actually going to need versioning before we go V1. And I would think that we would want versioning more if we did something that was radically different from V2. And the other thing is, it's also possible of using different groups, right? Like
Correct.
The evolution doesn't strictly have to be on the versioning grounds. We could also use groups to sort of simulate the same capability we get from version. It would kind of, admittedly, be a pretty funny or weird or strange when it came to like user experience, but it's possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also wouldn't think that like at any given point of time, the latest is what you consider as the state of the code. It may be alpha or beta or whatever, and there is no parallel API to that. I agree to that. So Federation, as of now, I think is not that complex that you need to have an older version release also and a newer version release also. But this used in the API path itself, asks or makes me question this fact. For example, even if we have initiated that API right now, we always say V1 alpha van or something in the API path, right? Even in the case of CRDs also we specify that. So that is where I find it reasonable to question this particular aspect. So if that's not there in the path at all, for example, we always say that, say Federation k.ktus.io / directly it could be federated API, something named, no version at all in between, right?
Yeah.
So that is the reason I question that. It sounds funny to me if we are not going to use version at all. Even in the case of CRDs, I don't understand that concept at all right now. When you initiate API in CRD, you provide all the GVK, the group version, and the resource name. So version is also there, but I don't clearly understand why does that documentation say that versioning beyond that is not possible. So for example, if we say do an alpha
release. You can
have
multiple, like when you define a CRD, like the nature of CRDs is it's an API resource. An API resource is just keyed by name. Like the way they have it set it up, I'm not saying they couldn't do it differently, but today, if I created an API, a CRD definition or CRD, it is, there's a name and it's cluster wide. And so in order to support versioning, you would have to embed the version in the name, and they haven't done that. So if you look at the validation, It's like it must be like my group name and my resource name, not the version. I don't know why they did that. There's nothing preventing them from putting a version in there. And like if you did try to do it today, it just wouldn't validate. Like it makes sure that the group name and the resource name specify is it forms the name of the resource.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
but
it makes sense.
But it's something that is on the plan. Versioning the CRD is something they are working on, right?
Right. I mean, the timeline is kind of indeterminate, but I guess my expectation would be by the time we need it, I think that there will have been progress, or we can certainly accelerate whatever progress has been made.
Yep. Honestly speaking, I'm fine with going either ways. Like if we continue and do a release with alpha, as I mentioned in that reply to Dario's mail, also, I'm fine with doing that. And if we can realistically migrate to CRDs, knowing this is a limitation, I know that there is no pressing reason to have real parallel APIs, like one API which is something like Federation V1 and then an older API which is Federation V1 Alpha 1 existing at the same time. I don't see any need of that as of now.
Quick question. Is the lack of more meaningful validation and defaulting in CRDs a concern for
yes, that is another point I actually was going to question. I'm not sure who was that spoke.
It's Ilya from Abound.
Okay, hi. Yeah. So yeah, that is also one limitation as of now. I heard or read somewhere that there is some mechanism using OpenAPI. The defaulting and validation could be implemented.
Yes, I tried that recently, and so far it appears to be limited to just schema validation. So if you want to have a little bit more involved validation, it will be challenging. Specifically also for resources which have pretty involved schema, the CRD definition can get very gnarly very quickly.
Yeah, if the validation is algorithmic fundamentally and it's go over just or regex or whatever, fundamentally you need an admission controller or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, another aspect is defaulting, because effectively, well, what they suggest is that you can do more extensive validation on the controller side, which I find it a little bit awkward because you basically already accepted the object in API and then controller has to reject it or fail it, which is kind of, I don't find it comfortable that way.
Yeah, for defaulting, the same is valid. The same that for validation. There are ways to do that using an OpenAPI, but if you want to do a push a defaulting, you need an external mutating admission controller.
So I mean, there's nothing preventing anyone from creating APIs in whatever way they want. I just think for Federation, the limitations with defaulting and validation are not really different in either case. The main problem for Federation is around templates because they embed Kubernetes types, which are generally very complicated and would require complicated validation. Today, using API Server Builder, all we're getting is basically a type check. So if a field is supposed to have like one of 3 constant string values, currently that will be checked. But in terms of defaulting, in terms of doing algorithmic validation that Dario mentioned, there is no provision for that. So by moving to CRDs, to me, we would either want to make sure that we can ensure the type safety we have today, if that's important. I mean, we could always just punt on it for now. The long run answer is we're probably not going to do defaulting, and the way that the propagator, the push reconciler works today, the way it compares versions allows for defaulting not being done. As long as, when it does a push to, or like when it reconciles with a member cluster, it'll record the versions of that reconciliation effort if it was successful. And as long as it doesn't change, it doesn't have to do anything. And so that kind of covers defaulting. In terms of more complicated validation, like algorithmic validation, I think our only answer is that we need to wait for dry run. So that's a capability that was listed on the issue that you pointed us at, Dario, involving like how do you embed a core type in a CRD. I don't think we have any better answer. Like if somebody requires algorithmic validation, as you say, you can do like you talked about an admission controller. I think like in the CRD space they just call it a webhook. like a validation webhook.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, it was a webhook. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's kind of the same thing. I'm just making sure I get my terminology right. So to my mind, like moving forward with CRDs would require deciding whether we care about the type safety or whether, it's not that the errors wouldn't be caught. It's just, do we want to catch them, spend the effort to catch them at the Federation API, or do we want to just leave them to be caught when they try to be propagated to underlying clusters? So that's a decision we'd have to make. But I don't really think that is a blocker to moving, because it's not big a deal. Like I think we could solve the problem of ensuring type safety. The rest of it we're not ensuring today, so we're not actually losing like safety.
This issue of defaulting and validation is actually more prominent in higher level types, because they have more fields or data which is part of the spec or whatever in Federation. So I think, if you take my opinion, it would be something like the benefit that you get moving to CRD is a little bit operational, in which case you don't have to run a separate API server, and that's it. That's what I see as of now. And benefit
I think that's
of
pretty big, though. I wouldn't want to understate the value in simplifying things, both from a user, like I guess from a developer and an operational perspective.
Yeah, and whereas if I see the drawbacks, I see a couple of them. Like to me, I don't know. I mean, how big is this operational benefit?
The defaulting you mentioned, though, because that I'm not sure I understand your concern with defaulting of higher level types. Are you talking about like scheduling?
Yeah, for example, I have used some stuff in scheduling. Say there is some field, for example, used as total replicas, which is target for this federation. So which I have put as something like 1, and validation should ideally be that it should not be something lesser than that. As an example, it's just I have a case for that, so I mentioned that advantage there.
Right. And so I guess the cost to potentially to you would be having to move to like a webhook instead
Correct.
of being able
some
to
other. I'll have to figure out some other mechanism of doing that.
Right.
If we move to CRD. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess to me, that would be another thing that we would want to investigate and see if we can decide whether it's worth the risk. I mean, I don't think webhooks are like particularly hard thing, but they do involve like, configuring TLS, deploying, something that can be called. So what I'd like is to be able to quantify the cost of that and be able to weigh it against the operational cost to the user of running an API server backed by SB. Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
Okay.
So yeah, if there are alternatives for these kind of things, see, versioning I don't consider a blocker at all, because as you mentioned that at any given point of time, federation could be considered in a particular stage. Either it is like alpha, beta, or GA kind of stuff, and that's the latest. So that's what user gets. But defaulting and validation to me is sort of a drawback. It might not be a blocker. We might be able to figure out some workaround, or no workaround would mean that this check would have to be in controller, and then after the API is created, we have to update status. That kind of I don't know how that would be handled, but it obviously is a drawback. So we might need to investigate this.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like I said, I'd like to see us quantify the cost and then be able to weigh it against the benefit. So defaulting, the cost of defaulting and validating via webhook versus like just being able to write code. Is there, it sounds like you have other concerns and I've kind of lost it. Is there other things we need to investigate to see whether it's going to be worth it?
Yeah, going into different mechanisms, I might imagine that there might be different ways of generating bins for the controllers, like
multiple binaries.
multiple binaries. Yes.
Okay. Because I'm not. That's kind of like not directly related to CRDs. I don't think. I think we could do that independently. But yeah, I agree. Both of those issues need to be investigated.
Yeah, there are only two main headings under which CRD versus aggregation can be investigated, which is defaulting and, I mean, we can highlight that as validation and defaulting, and the other one is versioning. So versioning, we have, we don't necessarily consider that as an advantage or disadvantage. So we need to validate validation and defaulting.
Yeah. I would say that when I consider a world where like other parties can create controllers and create API types, I would expect that they would probably not want to use aggregation if they could avoid it. So I'm not suggesting like we need to investigate. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But I'm thinking like, oh, I want to create some new capability, and I have big models for doing it with CRDs, which makes my life easy. Like I have examples for webhooks. I think the challenge today is we don't really have even real sample code for doing that. And so it's just an unknown, and it's a little bit unnerving. I certainly feel that way. If, on the other hand, we had examples in code, here's how you do a CRD, here's how you write, configure a webhook to provide validation and or defaulting, then I think it becomes a lot simpler. Like, not really today. The reason validation is easy because we have lots of examples of it implemented. If we had examples of webhooks implemented, I'm hoping that it would similarly seem more tractable.
Would somebody from this today's discussion, whoever is attending the meeting, would want to volunteer to have a look at this?
I'm going to hold out. If anybody else wants to do it, I'm totally open. To me, I think my priority is kind of driving to alpha, and if this is one of the tasks that needs to be done, I would be interested in doing it. But is anybody else interested?
I am interested in, not sure if I'll be able to do it in the actual repository, but eventually I can try to do it in a toy repository, eventually porting to the Federation WG repository, and let you know. And try to give you feedback for the next week.
Yeah, that would be great.
Sounds great.
Thanks, Dario.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Dario.
And I guess to the issue of multiple binaries, is anybody interested in taking that on? And that's basically just seeing if it's possible to, I think multiple binaries could be straightforward. I'm less clear on multiple images, and I haven't really looked at how API server builder or cube builder, how the build machinery is constructed.
Yeah, if nobody else is doing that, I'll take it up.
Sorry, guy, I have to leave the meeting, and see you next week. Thanks.
Thanks, Dario.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're over time.
Bye-bye.
So, okay.
Yeah,
so,
but actually, one of the important points was to talk about the possible items. Would it be possible for few guys who are regulars to stay 10 more minutes? Like extend the meeting for 10 more minutes?
Sure, yeah, I don't have anything after this. I was going to suggest that we could also just coordinate offline on this, but yeah, getting a list of, basically anything that any interested party thinks should be in an alpha, post it as an issue, tag it as a milestone, and ask for review. And hopefully we can have discussion, because then we're capturing the discussion. I'm not saying that we couldn't do it here, but I would hope that anything you want to see in the alpha gets documented as an issue or as part of an issue, and we can collectively review it. I would say like by next week, I would hope that we would have a list of issues that are largely definitive, and we can hash out the details of the individual issues if there is any contention. But in terms of like the high level deliverables, I think that should be something we can just capture as issues.
Yeah, I did actually create the issues, but I couldn't find any mechanism to, put it into the milestone.
Oh,
That's
is it
probably to do with,
something permission based? I guess
yeah,
that's
I
make
think it's
sure we give you
something like that.
okay.
Yeah.
Maybe that's I'm not at all. Anyway, I will see what's up. Maybe that you have to be added as a contributor
Yeah,
or something like that.
I think if that we are like Shashi and I added to that owners file, I think that might sort it out because uh, yeah, maybe
Oh,
there are some.
I'm pretty sure there should be a prow command because I think we do
Yeah,
have.
exactly. That's what
Yeah.
I meant. So if we are into the owners file, then we might be able to
Oh,
do that.
okay. I didn't even think of that. So yeah, add yourself, like raise a PR adding yourself to the owners
Sure,
file, and then if you still can't add to milestone, let me know. I'll investigate.
sure. I'll do that. And okay, then to conclude, then the next step, what we are going to do is, like you mentioned, that you might not have enough bandwidth to do a review or whatever of the PRs that we are raising. What I am going to do is probably we will do cross review between I and Shashi, and anybody else who is like interested in looking at those PRs is welcome from this group who are here, and merge them probably based on uh, our confidence.
Okay.
That sounds okay?
Well, so I would say that for the scheduling stuff, I don't
Mm-hmm.
think we really have the resources to give that too deep a review. But the DNS
Mm-hmm.
stuff, I think Ivan is definitely interested in providing some oversight on that.
Cool. I think Ivan had been giving some feedback on that. He has
Okay.
at least one round of review. I think he did.
And I guess
Yeah.
maybe we could have a like a general policy of just requesting like, are you interested in reviewing this? And then we can, say yes or no. And if it's
Mm-hmm.
yes, then we're not going to merge it without that oversight. But if it's
Mm-hmm.
no, I'm happy. You can go ahead and merge that. Then like once you
Yeah,
have owner's
that
permissions, you can
yes,
go ahead and do that.
that
And
makes
both
complete
sides
sense.
too. Like I'm not
Mm.
like a lot of the stuff that on the push reconciler, I've just been like asking for Red Hat review. Do you want
Mm-hmm.
the opportunity to provide oversight on that stuff, or are you happy to have a?
Yes. Actually, that's what. See, we got a little, and at least for a couple of more weeks, it will be similar. But I guess once after this month's over, not this month, the next month's over, and we are nearing alpha. After that, whatever we do, that's what I was suggesting. Uh, I would certainly be interested in looking into whatever updates Red Hat is doing.
Okay. So yeah, I'll make a point of and for all the Red Hat folks on the call, when we have code to show, give everyone an opportunity to look at it, and at least indicate whether or not they're interested in providing oversight.
Cool, makes sense.
Cool. Okay.
Okay, thanks guys. See you next week.
Thanks all. Take care.